So I wanted to touch on a few things before I present the slide, which doesn't give me much time. But Steve, is Steve in the audience? Steve, in relation to your conversations about enclaves and all these polarities that exist in the world, and I have to agree with you wholeheartedly, because in my travels I've found that this has been an ongoing problem for the last century. And but I have to admit, in the last 7 years, I've never ever seen such escalated growth in the breeding sector and in the training sector. And if you look at the Europeans currently, things have grown exponentially. So much so that I've been incredibly impressed with the results. And when you look at that, you realise that it existed because of the isolated countries around the world, particularly in Europe, like the Balkans, or East Germany, or West Germany, or the Czech Republic. I also realised that a lot of these realities that we see in the breeding and training world is a direct reflection of mindset. Does that make sense? So you look at the Czechoslovakian mindset, you look at the Serbian mindset, you look at the Greek mindset, you look at the Italian mindset, you look at all their mindsets, and their results are directly reflective of their mindset. So having seen that and realised that all these EU countries have united, things have grown exponentially, incredibly. But it's not existing in the UK, in the US, and in Australia. Would you agree? Anyone seen that? Yeah, I've seen it drastically. So let's move on. So there's a revolution occurring. We are witnessing a dog training revolution whereby traditional systems of dog training are being integrated with operant methods, creating the most powerful and humane systems of dog training ever in existence. In these elegant and tightly integrated systems, corrections are exploited to rapidly establish stimulus control over powerfully motivated behaviours. Rewards are used to teach and motivate performance, and a sophisticated system of conditioned behaviour markers are used to render it all clear to the dog. For those scientists that are sitting in the room, it'll make sense. So 33 years later, 33 years in working dogs, and it's finally making sense, I hope. Never in history has there been such unity in our country. 1980 to 2000 have been the most challenging years, not only in the working dog world, but in the dog world in general. Due to rivalry, insecurities, and the lack of science, our interpretation of behaviour was anecdotal and primarily based on distorted personal perception. This perception has filtered into our breeding and training systems, veterinary practices, general community, animal welfare groups, and the lawmakers, our politicians. Breeding and training results were largely based on trial and error, combined with pseudoscience and gut feeling. This distorted reality of breeding and behaviour is now at epidemic proportions, particularly in the UK, USA, and Australian dog communities. This needs to change. And for the first time, and Mia, I have to say congratulations, because for the first time, I think this is the step forward. And I've been trying to do something like this for 10 years, but I guess having a degree after your name has some sort of pull. So today's science is integrated with our breeding and training systems, providing an understanding of animal learning and quantitative genetics like never before. Yet the information seems to only be heard by those who genuinely want to listen. To me, I'm surprised that this room's not full. I'm actually shocked it isn't. As a breeder and trainer of dogs, I now know that the maladaptive behaviours we are experiencing globally is not only due to environmental stresses, but is largely embedded in the genetic makeup of every dog. We keep talking about the environment, but we're forgetting one thing. It's the genes that impact the environment. It's the genes that determine what's going on. We keep looking at one end and not the other. It has been proven time and time again that sensitiveness and fear, genetic tension as I call it, is highly heritable. Yet, what are the temperaments most people are breeding with? Fearful. And the typical reaction with humanity is, poor thing. I love my dog, poor thing. It's sensitive, I feel so sorry for him or her. Passive, it's a beautiful temperament. Soft, he always does what he's told. And driveless, he's so loyal because he stays next to me. It's a typical explanation of what I see in the community. Let's talk about Pavlov for a second, what he discovered in his research. He discovered that there were 4 types of dogs primarily. Pavlov discovered that a dog's degree of vulnerability to neurosis depended on its temperament. And he discovered 4 types of temperaments. Sanguine, very active socially and uncomplicated and flexible dogs, which is a type of animal we're working with from the private sector with regards to breeding and training dogs. And the results are quite amazing. You realise 33 years later that this is the animal that should be in society. This is the animal that gives you predictable behavioural responses. And this is the animal that gives you certainty. Phlegmatic, less active, socially retired and stable. Choleric, highly unstable, manic and prone to develop neurosis. And melancholic, low activity, socially withdrawn and susceptible to neurosis. Science indicates that dogs with weak, unbalanced temperaments were found to be more easily stressed and at greater risk of psychological disturbances than dogs who possess balanced and adaptive temperaments. Therefore, genetics are pivotal for a successful outcome, and mental inoculation via environmental stimulation can only cover or enhance what is possible from the animal. I don't actually believe anymore that environment environment does affect the temperament and affects the outcome. But I believe now that the environment will depict and show you what's really going on in your genes or in your dog, particularly from a breeding standpoint. So I've drawn a bit of a graph, and I'm forever trying to work out how I can present this type of stuff. And so far, the best model for me is this. I know now that genetics impacts with environment, and there's a reflexive connection between it. And if you look carefully at all those people that train dogs especially, or develop their puppies, you'll see the correlation. Genetics determine the reflexive response. If it's good, stable genes, the reflexive response is a positive outcome, and it becomes a positive loop. Likewise, the opposite occurs. The moment you start with inappropriate genes, you're working backwards. It's impacting with environment. It starts off negatively. We have to rotate our environment and create an environment that supports the dog and encourages the animal, which is a good thing. But in reality, they're not the dogs to breed with. They're not the dogs that we should be working with long term. So selection. So I'm convinced after many years of breeding and training dogs that the appropriate selection of certain traits is absolutely critical in achieving open and uncomplicated behaviour and the development of a breed based on performance and stable behavioural responses. Selection is critical because the results in our training responses and behaviours are not only related to the training system we adopt, but are also directly proportional to genetic resilience of the animal. The problem we all face is reaching agreement as to what a quality behaviour and then narrowing down the desired traits that produce such behaviours. To a large degree, these traits determine quality responses in our chosen application, be it IPO, for those people who don't know what that is, that's Schutzhund, police service dogs, ANKC, search and rescue, and anything else that requires drive behaviour. Traditionally, we have addressed addressed dog behaviour from the opposite end of the spectrum. The issue is, we are not addressing behaviour from a platform of rigorous testing and then measuring the best responses for the specific performance-related behaviours that are proven to provide behavioural outcomes that are predictable and adaptive. It is my personal opinion that we need a national testing system that exposes the desirable and undesirable behaviours, the genes, in all dogs, not just working dogs. All dogs. This testing will result in an immediate impact on temperament of dogs we will see in 3 generations. And I have to tell you that I've done that myself. I adopt this principle in my own breeding practices. I have ruined my breeding in 3 generations and have fixed it in 3 generations simply by addressing the very fact that if I select the right dog, I end up with the right puppies and subsequent progeny. It's directly proportional. So some background. Experience also recognises that there are additional factors that may influence maladaptive behaviours in dogs. These include competence of the breeder, owner, to adequately select, socialise and train and manage, amicability, environmental triggers, degree of control, dysfunctional defence mechanisms. Some strategies for improvement. General heightened awareness through education of appropriate dog breeding, selection, socialisation and training. The development and implementation of educational programs for both adults and children. Education programs targeting 3 to 8-year-olds. Behavioural research to investigate aggressive incidences. Genetic research to uncover inherited traits in dogs that may predispose to fearful aggressive incidents. Mandatory training for all dog owners. Please tell me you agree. Yes. Ongoing support for all new owners during their learning. Mandatory education for breeders on animal husbandry, puppy development, socialisation, genetic selection, identification of correct temperament. Mandatory education on behaviour for all veterinarians. Put your hands up, veterinarians. I'm talking about behavioural education, not your 6-hour course. I'm talking about lifelong learning. Mandatory education for our politicians, the lawmakers. Any politicians in here? I thought so. To help their decision-making processes. The breeder is the problem for me. It cannot be emphasised enough that it is the responsibility of breeders to ensure that all puppies are bred from rigorously tested stock and raised in environments which will assist them to attain their maximum innate potential through a strategic environmental interaction. The breeder must educate new owners and take full responsibility for their dogs if their dogs express health or genetic nervous tendencies. The breeder must ensure that the appropriate breeding partners are chosen, which must undergo rigorous emotional testing to establish behavioural volatility. And only in-depth testing can establish the behavioural volatility. That's what it is. I've always felt that, we'll talk about behavioural volatility for a second. I've always felt that canine aggression is one of the most difficult discussions to undertake due to the enormous complexity in canine behaviour. And you can all appreciate how complex this is over the last presentations. One of the main issues faced by everyone is that dog behaviour is fluid in nature and has a propensity for extreme volatility with dogs that don't have stable genetics and a balanced worldview. The opposite is true with dogs who have the appropriate genetics and social makeup. I've sat with countless dog trainers and behaviourists attempting to answer that mind-boggling question of how much impact does genetics and environment have on behaviour. You can imagine the disagreements. There are many still adamant that behavioural responses are largely impacted by environment. However, when you think about it deeply, it is deeply embedded in the gene makeup first, and the environment amplifies the innate reflexive responses that should be identified and socially engineered by the carer. I am of the personal opinion now that the end result is determined by 100% genetic makeup and 100% environmental stimulation. Everything matters. Bill, go away. So fear-based aggression and the learning of begins very early in the dog's life and continues right throughout its lifespan. Most cases of inappropriate aggression are caused through the aggressive displays, frequently being rewarded by the reduction of negative emotions and the dog was experiencing prior to the aggressive responses. Such negative emotions engage the dog's innate defence potential and the reaction occurs and reoccurs. The severity of the dog's reaction is again a combination of the dog's innate genetic potential in defence and the amount of success it has previously in reducing its negative emotional load while using aggressive responses. So fear is the immobiliser for me. The only way to minimise fear is to breed with sound and tested dogs, non-sensitive dogs, robust and driven dogs, dogs that react positively to stress, dogs that have courage, dogs that have intense and not just high prey drive, but most important, another thing is dogs that have a hard, solid grip because tug games depict mindset reality. I won't elaborate on that because I've only got 20 minutes, 5. You can look that up. Grip depicts mindset reality. Write that down. I believe we must be all well versed in the art of selection for breeding, the psychology of motivation and the learning if we are going to breed extraordinary dogs and train to get extraordinary results. To conclude, I must point out that I'm not one to believe that I'm always right, and I'm very aware that extreme rigidity in beliefs and dangerous illusions can work against you. Hence, I'm very interested in engaging in future discussions should you wish to discuss the ideas presented, because for me the concept of knowledge is continuous learning. After all, once we realise that imperfect understanding is a human condition, there is no shame in being wrong, only in failing to correct our mistakes. I think I got in time. This is a historic a moment for the working dog community in Australia, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the people who were instrumental in making it happen, particularly Mia. And I hope that it continues to be a support by not only our working dog communities, but by governments and all the stakeholders. That's important for me. And thank you for the invitation.